I am Dr. Sonya Whitaker, National Education Ambassador for Push Excel and Rainbow Push Coalition. I am also the Deputy Superintendent of Schools for Dalton Riverdale School District 148, located in Riverdale, Illinois. On behalf of Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition, we'd like to thank you so much for your gift of time. And while we have prepared to present to you today and a group of esteemed panelists, we are very cognizant of the fact that there are many experts in the audience listening in today. And for that, Reverend Jackson is forever grateful. I want to share with you that we have had an overwhelming amount of interest in this town hall. And as a result of that, there will be a part two. We've made some small adjustments, again, as a result of that, and that's positive. So in addition to there being a part two, we are hosting an education summit, and that will be held virtually on June the 9th, 2020. So please do be on the lookout for that. The title of this theme is Education in the Era of COVID-19. And in an effort to set the stage for you for what is to come tonight, I'd like to present to you the following information briefly. As we're aware, 56 million students in America's schools today are now at home receiving education virtually. And this has occurred as a direct result of the nation's attempt to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So what does this mean? I want to give you a quick snapshot of what this means as it relates to a conversation that we're going to have tonight relevant to access. I'll pause so you can let this graph resonate in your spirits. Today, this graph represents the percentage of students in households with no internet or computer access by income, as is evident at families whose household incomes ranges between $50,000 and less. They are least likely to have access to a computer or internet. The graph that you're looking at now represents the percent of students in households with no internet or computer access by race. As is evident, the students that have the least amount of access during the time when a greater majority of their learning experiences have to occur remotely are African American and Hispanic students, with American Indian and Native Alaskan Indians being impacted the greatest. With regards to students with disabilities, as many of us are aware, school districts are required by federal law to provide all special needs students with access to a free and appropriate public education, and school districts are provided to do so in what is referred to as the least restrictive environments. What does this mean to us today? For those of us that weren't aware, today there are 7 million students with disabilities attending U.S. schools. This number represents 14% of the total student population being remotely educated in the home setting, which is notably the most restrictive environments. And so, before I turn it over to Reverend Jesse Jackson, the spirit by which the presenters will present to you tonight, with their varying degrees of backgrounds, is united and aligned in response to this one simple yet very important question. And that question is, what does equitable access look like during and post COVID-19, particularly as it relates to the need to provide a quality education for all students, and more specifically, America's most vulnerable students?
Thank you very much, Reverend Jackson and Reverend Dr. Wilson, and thank you, Dr. Whitaker. I am honored to be here as we are kind of looking at a screen on Facebook, thinking about what we're still in the middle of when, the President of the United States pretends all is over, all is won, the pandemic is done, and we still know that we have not only unearthed and exposed most of the inequities in America in the last 2 or 3 months. But today, with almost 40 million people unemployed and with almost 100,000 people who have died, not numbers, but people who have died because of COVID, we are still smack dab in the middle of 2 emergencies, a health emergency and an economic emergency. And in that moment, what we, and something I don't have to say to you, but a health emergency and an economic emergency that has actually disproportionately affected people who are Native, Black, and Brown. So we've already seen that that 40% of the United States before this emergency couldn't put $400 together in an emergency. And now we have almost 40 million unemployed and over 100,000 people dead. We are trying, as the American Federation of Teachers, to do several things simultaneously in this COVID emergency. Number one, we are focusing on, like a laser, on the well-being of the communities we serve and the members in those communities. That includes most of the places in America where we see huge poverty and huge inequity. Number two, we are trying to focus on it like a laser on how we help the providers and how we make sure that they are provided for, including we just bought $3 million of PPE for people in hospitals, nurses, others who did not get this from their employers because Donald Trump has failed to do what he needs to do. Number three, in any emergency, in any downturn, the people who every single day come to public schools, their families, these are the people who are most hurt. We've already had 500,000 layoffs in education of those 40 million people. But we have to have the federal aid that is most directed to the people who need it most. So we have supported the COVID aid, and we need to support the HEROES Act and more. And number four, obviously, we need to deal with how to safeguard elections in a time where the Voting Rights Act has been lifted and where Donald Trump talks about elections like vote by mail as if it was fraudulent. All of these things, all the values of voice and equity and democracy and how one deals with education, all of it is now embroidered in this crisis. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to help feed kids. We've tried to help get kids the digital information they need. We've tried to open up all of our ways of talking to people, including Share My Lesson and other things, to make them free for parents. We've tried to get books to kids who are homeless. We've tried to do everything we can as teachers turned on a dime to make sure that they were educating kids in this remote and very unsuitable kind of way, particularly when you have the digital divide, where in some places 40% of kids are not connected because the cable companies will not connect them. So we've tried to do all of these things, but ultimately we know we have to get kids back to brick and mortar schools. And that's why the AFT put together, after 4 weeks of working with public health officials and others, this Reopen Safely plan. And what it includes in it are things like, how do we actually deal with the summer slide? Maybe we can this summer, if it is safe, get kids who are most in need to school. Maybe we can do that. We need money, we need funds, but we need to try if it's safe. What do we do in terms of the fall? How do we make sure that kids who are most underserved get the social, emotional, and instructional resources that they need? How do we do things in a hybrid or blended environment that kids who did not have access to digital learning get that access? We need to work with community, because what will happen is, if we do not work together, we're going to see Donald Trump continue to say, just flip the switch. This is a false choice. No one wants to be locked down anymore. I am married to a rabbi. We don't want to have a situation where our congregation doesn't meet. We don't want to have a situation where we're at home instead of connected. But it takes the kind of safety to ensure that the virus can't be transmitted in the absence of a vaccine in order to reopen, and in order to ensure that our kids are safe and that they are emotionally well taken care of. So we need to work with all of you to do these kind of things. We know that people tried their damnedest, excuse my language, to make remote education work. We know for some kids it did, but ultimately next year is going to have to be a year of bridging, of ensuring that the kids who are most behind get the most, of ensuring that we get the funds so that states whose funding is now crashing, that they don't cut kids, they don't forfeit our future. There's going to be a lot of work to do next year to ensure that people and our children get the kind of instruction and the social emotional attention they really need in the aftermath of this very scary and this very uncertain time. And we are honored to work with you on this.
Thank you, Jesse Jackson, for all you've done over the years, and for Rainbow Push Coalition for bringing us together a few days after the anniversary, the 66th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the disproportionate number of deaths in the Black community caused by the COVID-19, and the universal conclusion is that they're a result of underlying pre-existing conditions. And not getting as much attention, but we've been talking about it today, are the underlying pre-existing conditions in education that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. I mean, you just say achievement gap. Everybody knows what you're talking about. We had the chart on distance learning, and we know what the problem is. But rather than talk about the problem, let's talk about the solutions. Dr. Whitaker talked about the GAO report that talked about school segregation. That report, I'm familiar with it because John Conyers and I asked for that report to be done, and it showed that the segregation in schools today is about as bad as it was in the 1960s and getting worse, both by not only by race but also by class. We have legislation to deal with it. One is on Title VI, to amend Title VI to give a private right of action to people to bring lawsuits on patterns of discrimination, to appoint a secretary of assistant secretary of education designated for Title VI situations. And just like you have Title IX, every college has a designated person on Title VI to make sure that there's no discrimination going on. When the coronavirus started and schools closed, Congress took action. The first thing we did was to notice that when the schools closed, children weren't getting their meals. A lot of students get most of their nutrition from school meals. And so we provided waivers and funding to make sure those meals could be delivered at home. That's nothing new. It's what the school systems do every summer and make sure that the students can be fed even though the schools are closed. We funded early childhood education and Head Start. Early childhood education is so important that if you miss that opportunity, you never get it back. So if the schools are closed, we wanted to make sure those opportunities were still there. In K through 12, flexible money to address the problems, flexible, so that each school could deal with the problems of achievement gap. We heard about the summer slide, summer programs, teacher training. A lot of teachers weren't trained to do distance learning, and flexibility, particularly in things like special education. And we heard the funding for colleges. One, a lot of the money has to be spent on students who thought they had room and board covered through the end of the year, and now all of a sudden are looking for apartments and trying to feed themselves. Money has to go to support the students, but also money for keeping the campus together, trying to keep the faculty on board and everything else. Additional funding, significant funding went to HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. And for those with student loans, that was a problem before the pandemic. We made sure that there no student loan payments need to be made between now and September 30th, and no interest accrues during that period of time. But we know more needs to be done. And the first thing we recognized is that state and local governments are suffering from revenue shortfalls. Virginia showed this when our budget was done right before the pandemic, and several weeks later they came back for the normal veto session where we consider vetoes and amendments to the governor after revenues had been reforecast. And teacher raises were set aside. Money for low-income schools set aside. Counselors set aside. Hundreds of millions of dollars in school construction, a lot at HBCUs was set aside. Counselors, all of these initiatives set aside. So if we don't restore funding for state and local governments, doesn't matter what else we do for education, education is going to get cut. And so we restore money for state and local, but then we add another $100 billion for HBCUs and other minority serving institutions and other colleges, and flexible K through 12 money for things like special ed, summer programs, and everything else they need to make sure that we eliminate the achievement gaps and give an equitable education to our students. We made sure that teachers got essential worker pay, significant increase in funding, and that student loans, the relief we gave till September 30th, goes for an additional year. Now that bill has passed the House, and I noticed on the screen my distinguished colleague, Representative Castro, a member of the committee, that he and I have been working hard to make sure that that bill passed the House, but it now has to pass the Senate. Passing the House is not enough. It has to pass the Senate. And if so, education will get a significant boost and we'll be able to address many of the problems that have been discussed today. So Jesse, thank you for inviting me, and Dr. Whitaker, thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much for affording me the opportunity to join this robust and very important conversation this evening. I'd like to thank Reverend Jackson and the entire Rainbow family for having the discussion. NAAFI is the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education. It's a 51-year-old association of the nation's 104 historically Black colleges and universities, and now roughly 50 predominantly Black institutions. We serve as the voice for Blacks in higher education. When we started this discussion, Reverend and someone else talked about evening the playing field. When will we know when we even the playing field, and what does equitable access look like? What do we need to provide quality? So as I was listening to this discussion, and as I have participated in lots recently, I'm reminded that sometimes to invest equally in people and institutions is not to invest equitably. And this comes to mind because as we're talking about what do we do in emergencies and crises as we are in presently, a lot of people have said, for example, we've got to double the Pell Grant and make sure that low-income students, wherever they are attending school, can get a double Pell Grant. And certainly doubling the Pell Grant will help, and NAAFI supports it, and everyone that I know supports it. It is an emergency, and it is something that should be done. But importantly, what we need to talk about longer term is establishing opportunity institutions. The nation focused on opportunity arenas, opportunity communities, and we need to talk about opportunity institutions and investing in those institutions that educate and graduate disproportionate percentages of low-income students. So if we have an institution that has about 75% low-income students, as do HBCUs on average, and 45% first-generation students, as do HBCUs. And if they have 1/8 the size of the endowments of the average historically white college or university, then we should talk about special investments in those institutions, special opportunity Pell investments in those institutions. An institution that has the highest endowment and the lowest percentage of low-income students enrolled does not need the same resources to thrive as do those institutions that are doing the lion's share of educating first-generation and low-income students. And so as we talk about the agenda going forward, I would like the support of Rainbow Push and all of those in the viewing audience to join NAAFI in a discussion about and urging Congress to work with us to identify a class of institutions called opportunity institutions that are graduating the largest percentage of low-income and first-generation students. The second thing that I'd like to say just before my 4 minutes lapse are that I'm reminded by the discussion also the seminal importance of the census. As we're talking about solutions and getting dollars to our communities, when Congressman Scott, and I thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in all of the things that we're doing as the chair of the Education Committee in the House. Congressman Scott was talking about school meals, getting meals to low-income families when they're out of school. I also thought about the Kellogg Foundation invests a great deal in school-based health. All of the types of programs and resources that we need, not just in the double emergency in which we find ourselves with the worst recession in recent years and with the worst public health challenge that we have, but at all times, the communities in greatest need must be counted so that we can make sure that they have the resources that they're needing and they're deserving of. So I'd like to urge everyone who has not already participated in the census to do that and circle back and just talk about how important no longer just looking at Pell grants and attaching them to students, but look at the institutions that are educating disproportionate percentages of low income and first generation students and making sure that they have all of the resources that they need to make their students thrive.